Imagine a Britain where rivers froze solid, snow swallowed entire villages, and daily life became a battle just to stay warm. Coal deliveries failed, hospitals shivered with the patients under blankets, and tower blocks turned into vertical iceboxes. Families cracked frozen milk bottles for breakfast while scouts carried groceries over icy streets. In this countdown, we'll explore 30 moments when Britain's 1960s winters didn't just chill, they paralysed the nation. From frozen estuaries to stalled trains, from icy football pitches to homes without heat, these are the stories of survival, endurance, and a nation held hostage by frost. Frozen Britain awakes. The winter of 1962 hit Britain like a hammer of ice. In Yorkshire villages, drifts rose higher than carriage roofs, trapping milk deliveries and coal wagons. Families huddled around tiny grates, feeding fires with orange crates and yesterday's newspapers. Trains froze at stations, double-decker buses stood buried under white blankets. In remote hamlets, farmers dug paths to reach neighbours, sharing bread and coal. Children skated on iced-over ponds, laughter ringing against the frozen silence, while adults measured warmth by candlelight. But this was only the opening act. The frost that followed would push Britain to its absolute limit. Freeze that paralysed Britain. The 1960s winter gripped Britain like an iron vice. In Derbyshire, rail lines vanished beneath drifts taller than carriage roofs, stranding trains for days. Double-decker buses disappeared into city snowbanks, leaving commuters to trudge home through ankle-deep powder. Coal wagons sat useless on frozen sidings, forcing families in Leeds and Manchester to burn orange crates, old newspapers, anything that would spark a fire. Farmers checked frozen fields, finding livestock stiff in the frost. Shop shelves emptied as supply chains stalled. Neighbours became lifelines, sharing firewood and food, laughter and warmth over icy fences. But even as communities adapted, a harsher cold was quietly gathering strength, ready to strike next. Coldest months in UK history. Have you ever wondered what it feels like when an entire nation is trapped under ice? The winters of the 1960s turned Britain into a frozen wilderness. Roads vanished beneath snow taller than houses, trains ground to a halt, and coal deliveries became precious lifelines. Families huddled in single rooms, burning every scrap of fuel, while rivers froze solid and the sea along the coast turned to glassy ice. Shops emptied, hospitals overflowed, and simple daily routines became monumental challenges. Yet communities found resilience, sharing warmth, food, and hope. And just when survival seemed possible, whispers of an even harsher freeze hinted that the coldest months were only beginning. Snowstorms that stopped cities. Imagine a city frozen to a standstill, streets swallowed by snow so deep that life itself seems paused. In Manchester, double-decker buses vanished into icy labyrinths, while train carriages groaned under drifts taller than their roofs. Families scavenged firewood from fences and rationed coal in kitchens turned iceboxes. Farmers peered over frozen fields, watching livestock shiver against the merciless frost. Hospitals overflowed with frost-bitten patients, and simple errands became epic undertakings. Neighbours became lifelines, delivering groceries, stoking fires, offering blankets. But meteorologists whispered of storms still to come, blizzards more merciless, more relentless, ready to push Britain's endurance to the breaking point. Arctic siege of the 1960s. The winters of the 1960s descended on Britain like an unyielding Arctic siege. Drift swallowed roads, isolating entire towns, while rivers turned into smooth sheets of ice. Coal fires sputtered. Homes became iceboxes, forcing families to improvise warmth with anything they could find. Schools closed for weeks, factories ground to a halt, and buses froze mid-route, stranding commuters for hours. Communities adapted, sharing supplies, tending fires, offering blankets and comfort. Markets emptied, hospitals overflowed, and even the streets of London felt alien under heavy snow. Yet just as survival seemed possible, the frost tightened its grip, hinting at an even harsher freeze ready to test Britain's endurance. Icy grip on Britain. Villages and towns vanished beneath relentless snow, while rivers turned to sheets of solid ice, trapping boats and freezing harbours in place. Roads and railways became impassable, leaving communities cut off for days. Families burned every scrap of coal and wood they could find, improvising warmth in homes that had become icy cages. Trains sat motionless at frozen stations, buses disappeared into towering drifts, and shop shelves emptied as deliveries failed. Farmers trudged across frostbound fields, checking on shivering livestock, while neighbours carried food and firewood to those most in need. Just as Britons began adjusting to the frost, whispers of an even harsher freeze began to spread, one that would test endurance and community like never before. Frozen winters remembered. In towns across Britain, coal deliveries failed to reach homes buried under relentless snow. Streets were tunnels of white, and trains ground to a halt beneath drifts taller than carriage roofs. Families huddled in single rooms, feeding fires with orange crates, old newspapers, or anything that would spark warmth. Buses froze mid-route, leaving commuters to trudge miles through frostbitten streets. Villages relied on neighbours, sharing coal, food and blankets to survive. Children pressed hands to frosted windows, watching the snow pile higher, while adults laboured to keep pipes from bursting. Just when it seemed homes might hold warmth, the cold tightened further, and communities braced for a winter that had only just begun to show its true force. 1960s Frost Chronicles. Frost in the 1960s crept into every corner of Britain, coating rooftops in thick white blankets and whistling through deserted streets. Rivers froze into solid highways, trapping boats and halting trade, while roads vanished beneath relentless drifts. Families survived on dwindling coal, burning anything that would spark warmth as frost seeped through walls. Schools closed, factories paused, and essential services struggled to operate. Villagers and city dwellers alike relied on neighbours, sharing food, fuel and small comforts to endure the cold. Hospitals overflowed with patients chilled to the bone, corridors lined with blankets and makeshift heaters. And just as people adapted to the frozen routine, reports of deeper, more merciless frost began spreading, signalling that Britain's struggle with winter was far from over. Britain buried in snow. Relentless snow swallowed towns, streets and fields under thick, suffocating blankets. Trains froze in stations, roads vanished beneath drifts taller than roofs, and villages became isolated islands of white. Families rationed coal and scavenged firewood, improvising warmth in rooms that had turned to iceboxes. Shops stood empty, and hospitals stretched to care for frostbitten patients and exhausted staff. Children pressed faces to frozen pond surfaces, skating and laughing amid the silence, while adults battled biting winds and exhaustion. Neighbours carried blankets, hot tea and supplies, becoming lifelines in a frozen world. Yet even as communities endured, meteorologists warned of another surge of frost, an icy wave that threatened to bury Britain deeper than anyone could imagine. Extreme cold that shocked the nation. Britain awoke to frost that stiffened streets into icy walkways and turned rivers into glassy mirrors. Villages vanished beneath relentless snow while coal fires struggled to warm homes, forcing families to huddle under blankets and shared body heat. Trains and buses stalled, delivery trucks disappeared into drifts, and shop shelves stood bare. Even the countryside shivered. Livestock froze in fields, and farmers battled exhaustion against biting winds. Communities leaned on each other, carrying coal, food and care across frozen lanes. But as the frost deepened, whispers spread of a new, even harsher wave, one that threatened to overwhelm towns, farms and cities alike, testing Britain's endurance like never before. Winter of misery and survival. In towns across Britain, milk bottles froze solid overnight, their caps bulging under a layer of ice. Snowstorms blocked roads, trains stalled, and villages became islands under towering drifts. Families huddled around coal fires, rationing warmth and food as frost seeped into every corner of their homes. Schools shuttered, factories paused, and essential services struggled to function. Neighbours became lifelines, delivering firewood, sharing meals, and tending to the most vulnerable. Children pressed faces to frosted windows, marvelling at ice-covered streets, while adults battled exhaustion and illness. Yet even as Britons adapted, whispers spread of blizzards more severe than any seen so far, promising trials that would push the nation's resilience to its absolute limits. Legendary cold spells. In the 1960s Britain, frost descended like a merciless conqueror, blanketing streets, villages and fields in white. Rivers solidified, halting trade and trapping boats in glassy ice, while coal fires dwindled under the endless demand for warmth. Trains stalled beneath drifts taller than carriage roofs, buses disappeared into icy labyrinths, and villagers leaned on neighbours for food, fuel and company. Hospitals overflowed, shops emptied, and each day became a test of endurance. Children peered through frosted windows at frozen football pitches, imagining games that would never happen. Yet as communities adapted, whispers of a storm more severe than any before promised to challenge every household, every town, and the very limits of survival itself. Snowbound villages of the 1960s. Across Britain, villages vanished beneath thick blankets of snow, transforming homes and streets into isolated islands. Drifts rose taller than rooftops, rivers froze into impassable barriers, and trade ground to a halt. Families shared coal, food, and warmth, improvising in homes turned iceboxes. Children skated on frozen ponds, their laughter echoing across the silent countryside, while adults battled exhaustion, frostbite, and hypothermia. Shops stood empty, hospitals struggled to care for patients, and essential services could barely reach those stranded. Even as communities adapted to survive, the cold showed no mercy. A bitter wind carried whispers of yet another wave of frost, one that promised to reshape the landscape and challenge Britain in ways that had never been seen before. Historic UK winter storms. The 1960s delivered storms that would etch themselves into memory, burying towns and cities under relentless snow. Streets vanished beneath towering drifts, rivers froze into solid highways, and rural communities were stranded for days. Coal fires sputtered as families rationed every ember, improvising warmth in homes that had become iceboxes. Schools closed, factories paused, and trains ground to a halt, while buses disappeared into icy corridors. Shops emptied, and essential supplies ran short. Yet human resilience endured. Neighbours shared firewood, food, and comfort where official help could not reach. Even as Britain adapted, meteorologists warned of an even harsher wave of frost, one that threatened to challenge the nation's endurance in ways no storm had before. Frost-bitten memories of Britain. In the 1960s, frost carved deep marks into Britain's towns and countryside. Villages and cities alike vanished beneath thick snow, streets disappeared, and rivers froze into solid pathways. Families huddled together, rationing coal and burning anything that could spark warmth, while trains and buses ground to a halt beneath towering drifts. Children laughed and skated on frozen ponds, unaware of the lurking dangers, while adults battled frostbite, exhaustion, and constant cold. Hospitals overflowed, and shops struggled to replenish empty shelves as survival became routine. Yet even as communities endured, the frost left its mark on homes, livelihoods, and spirits. Beyond the horizon, meteorologists hinted at an even harsher wave, promising that Britain's struggle with winter was far from finished. Britain under ice, snowstorms gripped the nation with a quiet ferocity, transforming familiar streets and countryside into unrecognizable white landscapes. Rivers froze over, cutting off towns and villages, while towering drifts swallowed roads and railways. Families huddled in homes, burning every scrap of coal, wood, or paper to stay warm, as frost crept into walls and window frames. Trains stalled, buses vanished, and markets ran empty, leaving neighbours and communities as the only lifeline. Children skated across frozen ponds, laughter echoing against the stillness, while adults battled exhaustion, illness, and isolation. Even amid the frozen chaos, communities adapted creatively, sharing kitchens, devising sled routes, and pooling firewood, showing that Britain's survival wasn't just endurance, but ingenuity in the face of relentless cold. Icy blasts that changed daily life. The 1960s winter arrived like a relentless force, turning streets into rivers of ice and villages into snowbound fortresses. Frost-coated rooftops, vehicles were trapped in drifts, and railways became frozen arteries, halting movement across the country. Families burned coal sparingly, rationed warmth, and sought shelter in cramped rooms as icy winds gnawed at walls. Children skated on frozen ponds, laughing through the cold, while adults struggled with exhaustion, illness, and relentless blizzards. Shops emptied, and essential services faltered, forcing communities to rely on one another for survival. Neighbours shared supplies, tended fires, and offered comfort in creative ways. By the time the thaw began in some regions, Britain had learned that survival wasn't just enduring the cold, it was inventing new ways to live with it, reshaping daily life in ways that would linger long after the snow melted. Snowdrifts that halted transport. Snow arrived in waves, swallowing roads, railways, and entire towns beneath relentless white mounds. Vehicles were trapped, trains grounded, and deliveries of food and coal became near impossible. Families huddled in their homes, burning what little fuel they had while frost crept along walls and windows. Children found fleeting joy on frozen ponds, unaware of the exhaustion and danger adults faced just beyond their play. Shops emptied as supply chains collapsed, and hospitals overflowed with frostbite and hypothermia cases. Communities leaned on each other, sharing resources and warmth to endure the frozen isolation. By the time some towns saw movement return, the experience had transformed daily life. People had learned to navigate, improvise and survive in ways that would shape their communities for decades to come. Harshest UK winters ever, Britain endured winters that would be remembered for generations, each more unforgiving than the last. Snow-buried streets and villages, freezing rivers into impassable barriers and halting trains and buses across the country. Families struggled to keep homes warm, rationing coal and improvising with whatever materials were at hand. Shops emptied as deliveries failed, hospitals overflowed, and daily routines became battles against frost and isolation. Children laughed on frozen ponds while adults faced exhaustion, illness, and relentless cold. Communities drew closer, sharing supplies, firewood, and hope to survive. By midwinter, the frost had reshaped not only the landscape but daily life itself. New routines, clever improvisations, and neighbourly networks emerged that would define how Britain weathered its coldest months for years to come. Frozen lands and lost livestock, the 1960s winters transformed Britain's countryside into frozen wastelands. Fields disappeared beneath relentless snow, rivers solidified, and farmers watched helplessly as livestock struggled against biting cold. Tractors and carts became useless, and roads vanished beneath towering drifts, isolating entire communities. Families burned coal sparingly, layering clothing and blankets, while children played cautiously on frozen ponds. Villages relied on neighbours for survival, sharing food, warmth, and hope as frost tightened its grip. Shops emptied, hospitals overflowed, and daily life became a constant test of endurance. By the time some thawed patches appeared, the countryside had changed permanently. Farmers innovated new ways to protect livestock, neighbours forged lasting networks, and communities learned that survival required both resilience and creativity in the face of Britain's harshest winters. Winter catastrophes across Britain. The 1960s winters struck with a ferocity that left Britain reeling. Streets disappeared beneath snowdrifts, rivers froze solid, and entire towns were cut off from the outside world. Trains stalled mid-journey, buses vanished into icy corridors, and delivery trucks failed to reach shops, leaving communities scrambling for essentials. Families huddled in homes, rationing coal and sharing warmth, while children cautiously explored frozen ponds. Farmers battled the elements to protect livestock, many lives lost despite desperate efforts. Hospitals overflowed and daily routines became acts of endurance. By the height of the season, Britons had begun to rethink everything from heating and transportation to community support, proving that survival wasn't just about enduring the cold, but about reimagining life entirely under ice and frost. Chilling tales from the 1960s. Snow piled relentlessly across Britain, turning towns and villages into frozen fortresses. Streets vanished beneath towering drifts, rivers became solid pathways, and trains and buses ground to a halt. Families rationed coal and improvised warmth with every scrap they could find, while children skated and laughed on frozen ponds, unaware of the exhaustion and danger adults faced. Hospitals overflowed, shops emptied, and communities leaned on one another for survival. Neighbours shared food, tended fires, and found comfort in small acts of solidarity. In the quiet stillness of frozen mornings, new routines emerged. Sled routes for deliveries, shared kitchens, and improvised heating, showing that survival in Britain wasn't just enduring the frost, but learning to live, adapt, and even find joy within it. Whiteout Britain chronicles. Snowstorms swept across Britain like unstoppable waves, turning streets, villages, and fields into silent white expanses. Vehicles disappeared beneath towering drifts, railways froze solid, and rivers became impassable highways. Families huddled in their homes, rationing coal and improvising warmth wherever possible, while children found fleeting joy skating on frozen ponds. Shops emptied as deliveries failed, and hospitals overflowed with frost-related injuries. Communities depended on neighbours, sharing supplies and tending to the vulnerable as frost crept into every corner of life. Amid the whiteout, Britons discovered ingenuity in unexpected ways. Makeshift sleds for deliveries, shared kitchens, and creative heating methods turned survival into a collective effort, leaving a lasting mark on how communities would navigate the coldest winters for years to come. Freezing times that tested resilience. The 1960s winter gripped Britain with a cold that seemed endless, turning towns, cities, and countryside alike into frozen landscapes. Snow piled high against houses, roads vanished beneath towering drifts, and rivers became solid highways. Families burned coal sparingly, improvising warmth with blankets, newspapers, and shared body heat, while children skated cautiously on frozen ponds. Shops ran empty, deliveries stalled, and hospitals overflowed with frost-related cases, forcing communities to depend on one another. Neighbours shared food, firewood, and hope, inventing clever ways to survive the frost. By midwinter, routines had transformed. Makeshift delivery routes, communal kitchens, and shared heating arrangements became normal, showing that survival wasn't just about enduring the cold, it was about rethinking life itself under a relentless frost. Arctic cold snap stories. Winter struck with a silence that was almost unnatural as Britain's towns and countryside vanished beneath relentless snow and ice. Streets disappeared under towering drifts, railways froze solid, and rivers became icy barricades cutting off communities. Families huddled in homes, rationing coal and burning anything they could for warmth, while children skated on frozen ponds, their laughter echoing through the still frosted air. Shops emptied, hospitals overflowed, and essential services struggled to reach the stranded. Neighbours became lifelines, sharing food, firewood, and hope against the unyielding frost. As the frost endured, Britons discovered unexpected solutions: sleds for essential deliveries, shared community spaces for warmth, and clever ways to keep livestock alive, revealing that survival during these winters required not just endurance, but imagination and solidarity. Britain's winter trials. Snow fell relentlessly, transforming familiar streets and countryside into treacherous white landscapes. Roads vanished beneath towering drifts, rivers froze into solid barriers, and towns became isolated islands cut off from the rest of the country. Families struggled to stay warm, rationing coal and burning anything they could, while children skated cautiously on frozen ponds. Shops emptied as deliveries failed, hospitals overflowed, and daily life became a constant battle against frost and isolation. Communities adapted, neighbours sharing firewood, food, and hope to survive the unyielding cold. Amid the hardship, Britons discovered new ways to live with the frost. Makeshift pathways between homes, shared cooking fires, and innovative heating methods, proving that resilience was not just about enduring the cold, but transforming life itself to thrive in it. Frost and survival experiences. The frost crept over Britain like an invisible force, covering streets, rooftops, and fields in a thick, unyielding blanket. Rivers froze solid and snowdrifts swallowed roads, cutting off villages from the outside world. Families burned coal sparingly, layering blankets and rationing warmth, while children found brief delight skating on frozen ponds. Shops ran empty as deliveries faltered, and hospitals overflowed with frostbite and hypothermia cases. Communities leaned on each other, sharing food, firewood, and hoped to endure the relentless cold. As the frost tightened its grip, ingenuity flourished. Villagers carved sled paths to stranded homes, neighbours built communal cooking fires, and families devised clever heating hacks, revealing that Britain's survival depended as much on creativity and cooperation as on endurance alone. Cold snaps that shaped generations, snow and ice swept across Britain with an intensity that left towns and villages unrecognisable. Roads vanished beneath towering drifts, rivers froze into solid highways, and entire communities were cut off from the outside world. Families huddled in homes, rationing coal and layering blankets, while children cautiously skated on frozen ponds. Shops emptied, hospitals overflowed, and daily life became a struggle against frost, illness, mace, and isolation. Communities leaned on one another, sharing food, firewood, and support, forging bonds that would endure long after the snow melted. By the end of the cold snap, the nation had changed. Abandoned streets became pathways for camaraderie, frozen rivers turned into meeting places, and small acts of kindness left traces in their memory far longer than the frost itself. 1960s snowstorms and chaos. Blizzards struck Britain with relentless force, burying streets, villages, and farmlands under thick, unyielding snow. Roads disappeared beneath towering drifts, trains stalled on frozen tracks, and delivery routes collapsed, leaving shops empty and communities isolated. Families rationed coal, layered blankets, and burned anything they could to keep warm, while children cautiously explored frozen ponds. Hospitals overflowed with frostbite and hypothermia cases, and daily life became a battle against exhaustion, cold, and isolation. Communities drew closer, neighbours sharing resources, firewood, and hope. By the time the storms eased, new routines had taken hold. Frozen streets became communal paths, kitchens turned into gathering hubs, and Britain discovered that even in the harshest winter, everyday ingenuity could transform hardship into lasting memory. It's memories that defined an era. Britain was gripped by a cold that seemed eternal, with snow piling high across streets, towns, and countryside. Rivers froze solid, railways ground to a halt, and villages became isolated islands of white. Families struggled to stay warm, rationing coal and burning whatever they could find while children skated cautiously on frozen ponds. Shops emptied, hospitals overflowed, and daily life became a test of endurance against frost, exhaustion, and isolation. Communities drew closer, sharing food, firewood, and hope, forging bonds that would last long after the snow melted. When the thaw finally came, the land bore the traces of struggle and ingenuity alike. Streets and fields slowly re-emerged from the ice, but the stories of resourcefulness, courage, and unexpected unity endured, reminding a nation that even in the harshest winters, the human spirit could shine brighter than any frost.